Hello and welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So this week I'm going to create 2 videos and they'll probably end up being a bit longer, and that's just because I don't think that there's a easy way to split up the content for these next 2 chapters. So this first video is going to be looking at tables, and this is going to correlate with chapter 9. And then there's going to be chapter 10, which is going to be looking at working with forms. So this whole video is all going to be just working with tables. And then the next video is going to be all about working with forms. And just to give a little bit of course context as well, I would say that chapter 7 and chapter 8, I would say, are the hardest chapters throughout the whole semester. In particular, chapter 8, just because there's so much content. So from here on out, things should get easier. There will still be certain things that might be challenging, especially with forms, just because there's a lot of new information. And this is also where we had been looking at a lot of CSS styles. And we're going to have a bit of a return to working with HTML more. So this is going to be introducing how to create tables with HTML, and then also how to style things a little bit. And then it'll be the same thing working with forms, how to mostly work with HTML and forms. And then there's going to be a little bit of instruction on how to work with styling. Just to kind of give you a bit of a picture of what to expect, is we are going to be returning more towards HTML. Now, this also means that the homework, I think, should start going a little bit quicker, just because there's going to be kind of less things that are going to be focused on. So, for example, the homework that's going to correlate with this video, you're going to be adding, and let me see if I can actually bring this up real quick. All right, let me zoom in a little bit if it'll allow me. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be adding this table to one of your pages. So you no longer have to worry so much about trying to get the media queries to work and the templates on all the pages. I'm also going to be changing the grading where it's going to be focused a lot more on just this particular piece. So if you still have things that are not working with the last assignment, which is by far the hardest one, just because there's so many different pieces, I'm going to be focusing on grading the new information tables. If you still have things that are carrying over that you need to correct, maybe from the last feedback that was given, I'll still let you know things that aren't working from the code validation and everything, but I'm going to be focusing in particular on this table section and giving you feedback on that. And then same thing when I grade the form, is I'm going to be focusing in particular on those requirements for the assignment for the form, which is something I've been doing before as well. It's just with the last 2 assignments, it's been focusing so much on the layout and how the whole website's all coming together. And what's going to be nice about this is even if there's things that are broken with your wrapper or your media queries, I'll still be able to see the table and see if you've gotten that part right or not. All right, so the lecture will end up probably being a bit longer just because it's all going to be condensed, but I do think the homework should go a little bit quicker at least, and that'll help give you some more time where you can really be focusing more on the final project. All right, so there's not going to be a whole lot of links this week, if you wanted to see. Now some of this is going to change because I'm going to update what this section looks like for the links and everything, but you'll see I've got a link for pseudo classes, and that's because that's going to finally come back up again, and you might forget the term, but pseudo classes were what we were using to change the styling for different things that you would interact with. So when you are changing the style of a link, when you are using the link, visited, hover, active, those are all pseudo classes. And so there's going to be a few pseudo classes that we're going to look at this time. And then in the next video, since we'll be talking about forms and how to actually send information back and forth, that's where that PowerPoint's going to come in with the server-side processing. So you don't have to worry about that quite yet until you get to that video. And then you'll see that There's the reading, assignments, quizzes for the week. And the last thing I really want to just mention is hopefully by now you all have an idea of what you want to do for your final project proposal, and that you have run that past me and just made sure that you have permission to move forward with that. If you have any questions while you're working on the research for it, feel free to reach out to me. And that final project is just going to be the last thing that ends up being due this semester. And if you haven't been looking at the syllabus, make sure that you take a look at the timeline of everything. And I've got this red right now because I'm going through and I'm replacing my video. So anything that's still red at this point is something that I'm still going and recording. But you'll see that this next week, week 7, so the one after this, I'm going to be going over chapter 11's content. So what's really nice about this, and I know this last week probably felt very rushed and that there was a ton of different things to look at. This next one, I'll be introducing working with audio, video, and just really basic kind of animation sort of things. Just having something change over a little bit of time. So that's going to be the main focus. And then just generally talking about responsive design again, giving you some ideas and hopefully some inspiration for working with your final project. And then the only thing you're going to have to worry about is assignment 11. So that's trying to help clear up some time where you can really work on your final project. That would be a really good week if you wanted to meet with me and show any sort of rough draft or just kind of beginner version of your website. And if you've got like a wireframe or anything that you want to show me to look at, that would be a really great time. And then our last week, week 8, is a short week. And that's just kind of the structure of the summer semester, is that you, it ends a little bit early, just kind of like we started in the middle of the week. That's going to be on a Thursday. So it's not going to be a standard Friday when that's going to be. It's going to be due on a Thursday. But that's going to be the only thing that you have to worry about all week, is just working on that final project and turning in any late work or anything that you have. And you need to make sure that you have absolutely everything turned in on that Thursday by that date, or else it's not going to get graded. All right, so if you do have any questions about tables after you watch this, you can definitely add questions to the discussion, or you can send me an email. But if you also have questions about the remaining weeks and the final project and just kind of the overall timeline of everything, just because you want to make sure that everything gets wrapped up well, you can also reach out to me about those as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code, and then I think I'm just going to open up Word just in case I want to write down any notes. But you'll end up seeing all of the elements that we're going to be looking at as examples in our demonstration anyways. Now, the first one that I'm going to show you is basically the same thing that you would have in your textbook. So you'll recognize it when you go through and you do your reading as well. So before I actually start the file, the way that you create a table is going to be using, and I'll go ahead and just make this full screen. You're going to be using a table element, and these are pretty straightforward, where you just have table opening and end tags. So everything that's going to be in your table needs to go in these tags. So pretty straightforward. Now, this is going to be kind of similar in some ways to working with a grid, but a lot simpler. And I think I had mentioned in the grid video that websites used to actually be constructed with tables back when they were fixed. And so you can put a lot of content inside of a table. People will often use it to help organize information into grids and columns. And even if it isn't fixed, you can make it pretty responsive. There are some issues, though, with it being responsive, and this might be something that you encounter when you're working on your final project. So I'm going to give you a little bit of flexibility there, and I'm going to say, well, and if you look at the final project, you do have a requirement for making a table, and it says that you need to have 4 by 5 cells. I'm pretty flexible on that, and so if it needs to be like 3 by 8 or something, and if you need help brainstorming ideas for your research project, like what would fit best for putting in a table, I can help you come up with ideas. I've had people do all sorts of things, whether it's putting their credits in the table even, or I've had people where they weren't really sure what to do with their content, so they use information from the course objectives page. They just put like the course schedule in a table or something, even if there wasn't really anything to say. I mentioned this with the grid, that we're going to work in rows and columns, and tables going to be the same thing. Now, the part of this that ends up being a bit different is that everything that we are going to put in the cells of the table is all going to be organized by rows. So I'm going to underline this for now. So we've got our table element, and then we have our table rows element, or maybe that'd be better to say table row element, but this is written with TR. So T for table, R for row, and so you would go across and you'd figure out every single row's information, and then that's where you would put in your table data element. And this is the cell basically. And that's going to be TD. And then we also have our table header element. That's also a cell. And that's going to be written with TH for table header. Now for the header, that's basically like the equivalent of having like an H1 and H2 and H3 and so on and so forth. It's just the heading for whatever your different columns and rows are going to be. And you can place them at the very top. You can place them on the side. You might have headers going both directions if the information is being organized in a way where you have two kind of sets of information. You want to show the overlap of where the information is contained by both things. Most of the time you're going to have some sort of header, and then a lot of times you will pair your headers with your data cells, so that way for accessibility purposes, that through the code you're saying that these things are linked, so that it's not just kind of so it's not just next to each other, it's actually associated with each other. So how that would be done is you would take your TH and you would add an ID, and you would give it a name of some sort. So let's say that you are creating a list with like first names. So you could say, I've got an ID of first name, and then you would put in, let's try to write first name, and then you would have your whole column or your row of names. And so then you would take your cells and you create a TD, and you write headers with an S. So to add to the head, heading, header, headers confusion, we now have headers. So be careful. You do need to have the S, and it's going to associate with that ID. So we're going to say headers is equal to whatever the ID is. So I'm going to say first name here. And then you could put in the name. So like for mine, I can just put Whitney. And so we've got that now. And then you could go in and you could put in other names. So we've got another one, first name, and then whoever else you might have, and so on and so forth. And then we could have another column. That one could have last names. Maybe we're doing a roster of everyone in the class, and we've got a column with first name, last name, and then all other sort of information that we might have for it. So headers pairs with the ID. So that's going to be our first part. And then I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now before actually applying any of this, so please bear with me. The next thing I want to go over is there's two attributes that that are grouped together, and that's called column span and row span. And I'm just going to say these are attributes. It's been a little while since we've talked about attributes, but again, attributes are ways for you to specify information about an HTML element. So kind of, you can think of it kind of similar to how we have the properties with CSS. So attributes attribute a value to an element, and then properties apply a property style with a value to an element that you select with the selector. So trying to use the terminology so that way it kind of helps it stick a little bit better. All right, so this lets you say how many cells do you want something to span. And if you've ever created a table or anything before, you've probably used the ability to have your cells in your table like merge together. So for example, let's say that we have this table and we've got the 4 cells. I could take these 2 cells and I could say I want to merge these cells together, and so whatever information I would put in here is going to span this whole cell, and then we've got these 2 are acting separately. And then I could also say that I want to merge the cells vertically as well if I have this set up. Let's do this. So now I can also do the same thing vertically as well. So that's essentially what column span and row span are doing. It's allowing you to merge cells together vertically or horizontally. So what you would do is you would choose either a TD or a TH. It could be either one. And you would say, I want this cell to have a column span, and then you say however many you want it to span. So this would be saying, I want this cell to span 2 columns. And again, columns are going vertical, rows are going horizontal. So in this table that I have here, this would be a row span. So TD column span 2, and then you would just put in whatever information would go inside of it. So I'll just put text goes here. And then as you can probably imagine, the row is going to behave the same way. I'll do a TH this time. So here we could have row span equals, let's just say 3. Then we have got text goes here. And so that would merge together 3 rows of information. So I wanted to mention this first before actually going into the first example, because one of the first examples in the book actually goes into using column span and row span. Now there's one last thing that I want to cover before actually going into our example, and that one is scope. It's going to sound kind of similar to the idea of working with the headers, and by that, that's this part again where you use the header attribute. And this might get confusing. So there is the table header element. Let me just add a note here that there is also the table headers attribute. So hopefully that will clear that up a little bit better. So this attribute is associating these together. Now there is also an attribute called the scope attribute. And this one, I'm going to just take the words from the book. It specifies the association of table cells and table row or column column headers. Let me give you an example and then I'll help define it. So let's say we have a header and then, or TH, and then we have a scope. So you can set it to column or you can set it to row. And then let's say we're going with this first name idea again. So I'll just say you can use column or row. So this is different than this idea with headers. With headers, you are associating it with individual cells. So you could even have it where something is in the same column or the same row and it's not actually attributed to that particular ID. And so what the scope does is it's basically saying everything that is in this column or everything that's in this row is going to be within the scope of that TH. So if you have TH scope column first name, then you're saying everything that is in the same column as this TH is all going to be paired together. It's all associated together with this first name. And so that, again, back to the idea of having a roster of names, you would know everybody in this column is going to be, they're going to be first names. So it gives you a little bit of options where you can choose, do you want to mention the scope of the whole column or the whole row? Do you want to just do individual cells? So you have some options there. All right, so now let's go ahead and go back to, I'm going to make this a little smaller. Hopefully it's still going to be easy enough to read. I'm going to go back over here. We'll just create a new file. All right, so I'm going to save this into a folder called week 6 on my desktop. And I'm just going to call this tables. I'll choose HTML. Now I'm going to try to put everything in the same folder for starters, and then at a certain point it's probably going to get too long and it's going to be hard to kind of see everything because I'm going to end up having to scroll a whole lot. And so when things get complicated, I'm probably going to save this over into different new tables, but we're going to kind of start with the same thing. So this is where I'm coming back to the example that is from the book. But first we need to set up our file kind of like normal. So the title, I'm going to put tables. To keep things brief, I'm going to just kind of put the bare minimum of what we need so that way we don't get validation errors. And then we're not going to worry about having a regular wireframe or anything. We're just going to jump straight into having a table. And so I'm going to write in our table element. And then what you do with your rows is you're just going, what I like to do is I like to organize them like this, where you have them nested. So we're going to have 2 rows. So I'm going to do this. And then we need to plan out our cells. And in order to be able to see our table for starters, actually, I'll come back to this. What I'm going to say though is, in order to see our table, we are going to want to use a border so that way we can actually see each of the cells. And you definitely want to do that in your CSS, but a lot of the examples, they start off first by introducing the HTML. And so they're going to have you use the border attribute to add a border to your table. This is something that is going to be outdated and you might get validation errors for it, but it's going to be what we do for the first couple of these until we start looking at the CSS. So, but I would rather have this structure first, and then we can actually take a look at what it looks like without the border, and then we can add the border as needed. All right, so in our first row, I'm going to create a TD. And let me go ahead and make that full screen. So we're going to have a cell, and in the opening tag, in the opening tag, I'm going to put column span. So it's going to span 2 columns. And then inside of the tag, it's going to say this spans 2 columns. And just for the sake of saving space, I'm going to put that on one line. So this is going to be a 2 by 2 grouping. So it's going to be 4 cells all together. This first one is going to span 2 of them going across. So the way the rows work is you would have all of your columns. So I don't need to make a second one because this one is going to take up the span of 2 of them. And then in the second row, I would do a TD. And this will say this is just column 1. And then I can make another one, and this will say column 2. So you can probably envision what this would look like. But let me go ahead and open it. All right, so this is where I'm going to end up going and adding in the border so you can actually see it. But we've got this first one is spanning across the distance of these 2, and then these are their own cells. So I'm going to go to this table opening tag. I'm going to write in border equals 1. And that's actually going to give us a border so that way we can look at this a little easier. Now I want to show you what a row span would look like. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to create another table, and this is where, if you are following along with this, you could add some comments. So you could say this table demonstrates column span, so that way you can kind of tell them apart. I would also probably suggest adding in some white space. You could even put in actual space. So you might put in a couple of breaks. And then you might say this table demonstrates row span. And then I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to add in the border. Now, this one ends up being a little bit trickier. And when you are creating your table, if you want to do something that isn't super straightforward, where you do want to merge your cells together, I'd really recommend that you draw it out. So in this case, we want the first cells of the 2 rows to merge together. So we know at least, actually, let me go ahead and create both rows. So we have, whoops. So we've got our 2 rows. So our first one, we're going to have a TD, and we're going to say, I want the row span to be 2. And then we'll have text that says this spans 2 rows. Now, this leaves the second column empty, and so we do need to have another TD here. This one will say row 1, column 2, just to kind of help demonstrate where that's going to be. Now when we get to our second row, it already knows that the first space is already taken and already filled up. And so you don't actually need to do anything to add in space or associate space for this row. It's just already gone. It already has been taken up by that space. So it knows that anything else that gets added here has to get added in somewhere that isn't that cell that's right next to it. So this one, we can just do TD and say row 2, column 2. And so it's going to do the last one. So let's save that, refresh. So you can see here, it already was filling in this space. And then we've got our 2 rows here. So I think at least that this ends up being a little harder to visualize. It ends up being kind of interesting because as you work on these, this still only counts as the first row. So later at a certain point, I'll show you how to add styles where you can alternate the colors of the different rows. And so like, let's say that we have our row 1 and our row 2, and we said this top one's going to be blue, this next one is going to be red. This whole entire cell is counting as row 1. It's just that it doesn't include this. So you might end up having a weird pattern if you were to repeat this whole block over and over again, because this one would end up being the same color as the next one and so forth. Or you could end up having them kind of counting rows at a different rate, where you've got these ones are changing color twice as fast as the ones on the left. So something to just know is that this one's being counted as that first row as you're trying to style it and select it. All right, so something else that we can do is we can add a caption to our table, and I can just do this with this first one. This is done with a caption tag, and you would just have your title, or it could even be a caption. Like maybe you are trying to show certain information and you just want to name it like figure 6.4 or something like you would see in your textbook. So text goes here. Just refresh that. So you'll end up seeing this text. So you can also, eventually when we talk about styles, you can actually change the side that goes on if you wanted to go on a different side, like if you wanted to show on the bottom, but you would still place it in the same place. Like if I took this caption and I put it at the bottom of the table, it's not going to change where it shows up. It's always going to just show up here at the top. It's the styling of it that's going to change where that's located. But you do have a caption tag. I can add that over here. So you have the caption element where you can put in titles or descriptive information. Now, I personally don't like the default of the caption just because I think that the text is really understated. It works good for something where you are trying to give maybe credit to the information in the table, but for a heading or for a title, I think that it's a little bit understated. But depending on the purpose that you have, you could go and change it so it fits better for what you're wanting to do. All right, so I'm going to have us create a third table so that way we can have some content for when we talk about styles. And we're not necessarily going to, we might use a column span, but we're probably not going to use the row span just because it ends up being harder to work with style-wise. So again, after your table, you can add in some breaks, just add some space. You know, I don't have a note in mind yet. We can come back and add that if we needed. But let's go ahead and add a table. I'll add in border equals 1. All right, so the idea that I have for this is creating a table that goes over your schedule. And I know with this being a summer class that your schedule, this could be the only class that you have. It might not be kind of a representative of your typical schedule. So if you wanted to, you could put in your schedule as far as like other things fit into your schedule. You could just create up a fake schedule. You could create your schedule for if you're taking classes in the fall, you could put out your schedule for your fall classes. But the idea here is I want there to be information on the name of, for example, the name of the class, what days it meets, what time it meets. So if you're subbing in information, just try to think of things that would be on certain days and kind of certain hours, and that they would have a name for it. So maybe it's even just like one class, and then you've got like your work schedule or something filled in as well. All right, so we're going to start with a row. And actually, we're going to add a caption before this. And I'm going to say, again, you can make this fit your situation. So let's just say it's like summer 2022 schedule, and then it's kind of up to you what you want to put in it. And then in our first row, we are going to have our TH, and we're going to have it be a scope of a column. So everything in this column is going to be associated with this. And I'm going to call this class. If you are having other things that you're going to put that aren't classes, maybe you just want to say like reoccurring events, or however you would want to define it. It could even be like class and work, but it's however you want to differentiate these things. All right, so that's going to be our first column heading. And then I want to do one that's going to be another TH. This is going to have column span set to 2. And we're also going to have scope of column. And I'm going to say meeting time. Now, if meeting time doesn't really make sense, like with work, maybe you just want to say event time, or whatever kind of wording you think would make the most sense for fitting in with your schedule. So this is going to be our categories. So we're going to have 3 columns going across. For the meeting time, we're going to basically split things into the day and the time as well. So then we'll create as many rows as you want. And I would prefer if you have at least 4 or 5 rows, even if it's just duplicating the same thing. So I'm going to kind of make things up because my summer schedule, like yours, is probably different than normal. So I can do TD, and then, so class, I'll just say web 110. So I've got web 110. And then I would put in my next TD, and I'm going to make this day. And so let's say, a lot of times I teach this class on Mondays, so I'll just put Monday. And then I also often teach this class at 9 a.m. to 11:50 a.m. So that'll be one of my classes. And then I'm just going to copy the same thing. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm just going to copy it 5 times. Let me hit save. So now we can see the schedule. Summer 2022 schedule. There's, I guess 5 sections of web 110. And then I just put them all at the same time. So you could go in and you can kind of individually fill this out. But I want to try to keep this shorter because I know that I tend to go on quite long anyways. All right, so we've got our schedule of our different items. Now going back to that idea of working with the headers and the ID, we already do have the scope, but we might as well practice working with those as well. So we would need to go back to the top, and actually let me show you our notes again. So first with the TH, you add in an ID, and then the cells, the TDs that are associated, they use headers. So we need to find our IDs. And the reason I wanted to use this is because we do have this meeting time that spans 2 columns. And so this is a really great place for us to say, okay, the ID of this is going to be, I'm going to say class name. And then I'm going to put the ID for this one is going to be called meeting time. And so this TD is going to have headers is going to be equal to class name. Let me actually change this so it's consistent with camel casing. And then this TD, I'm going to say headers equals meeting time. And once you have this, you could even just copy it so it goes a little quicker. So now it's saying both Monday and the time are both associated with this. Versus with scope, it's doing it based off the rows. So this is just making sure that it all works together. So I'm going to copy this, and in every one of these first ones where it has the class, I'm going to add this. And then let me copy the meeting time. Everyone that has a day and a time, I'm going to add this in. All right, so that's visually not going to do anything, but it's going to help a lot behind the scenes to just associate that information with each other. So far, this is all I really want to do with this example. We could take another look at it again, where we've got now our Web 110, Monday, and then our time. Now you'll notice some things about, or at least for me, the default styles of the table, I think, make it really difficult to read. You'll notice that we've got our text is serif by default. The padding around these is really hard to read. This double border, where we basically have a border that is added to every single individual cell, and then it's also added around the whole table as well. The spacing of everything is just really tight next to each other. Now you'll notice that when you do have the TH, you have the text will center, and then it will also be bolded. So it does behave kind of similar to your like H1, your H2, your H3, where it has that default where it will bold. Now, if you go to your book, it's going to list a bunch of different styles. Let me see if I can find the page. Now, we're not necessarily going to go over all of these. What's interesting about this one is there are HTML attributes that you can use in the table, like border, which we already used, that you could use, but those are going to be outdated and they're going to be a worse practice for you to use compared to styling with CSS. So it's going to tell you you can use align as an attribute, or you can use width and margin, kind of doing the same thing we did with the wrapper, where you just have the margin as auto and it'll center it. And then we have a width attribute and a width property, height attribute, height CSS property. And then if you wanted to add padding around the cells of everything, you could add padding. Cell spacing is now called border spacing if you do it in the CSS. And that configures space between cell borders with a numeric value. If you set a value to 0 and emit the unit, one value configures both horizontal and vertical spacing. When two values are used, the first value configures the horizontal spacing, and the second value configures the vertical spacing. And then there's also border collapse, which you'll see configures the border area. The values are separate, and collapse removes extra space between the table and the cell borders. So if you didn't want there to be, or let me find, where is it? If you didn't want there to be spacing between this outer part where there's the cell and the table, you could actually use that and it would help remove it. So that's the collapse. And then you got your background color, vertical alignment, border style, border spacing, background image if you want that, caption side. So you can specify if you want it the top or the bottom. So those are going to be your basic styles. A lot of it's pretty straightforward because a lot of it is stuff that you've used already. So what I'm going to have us do is go back to this example, and we can now remove border from any of these tables. So we've got the 3 tables. I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And then I'm going to go up to the top and add in tags for adding in styles. And I'm going to add in a table style. It's going to say I want the margin to be auto. That's going to center it like the wrapper did. And then I'm going to say I want the border to be 5 pixels solid. Whoops, I forgot to hit shift. 003366 for the color. And then width of 600 pixels. So this one I'm creating a fixed size. You wouldn't have to do a fixed size. You could do, you can make it flexible for what you end up doing for your final project. And then I'm going to say both the TDs and the THs are going to share the style. They're both going to have a border of 1 pixel solid. And then same thing, 003366. And then I'm going to do padding of 5 pixels, font family, Arial, sans serif, just to try to make it a little easier to read. So the padding is going to add just a little bit of space, and then we're choosing a sans serif. If you also had a bunch of text that would go onto the next line, you might also add a little bit of line height for each of them. And then we'll do one for caption. Say font family Verdana sans serif. Save that real quick. Try to make that easy to see at the same time. All right, so I zoomed out really far so that way you can kind of get an idea, but we basically have a blue border around each of our cells now, and I added a different thickness to the border. So we've got the outer border is 5 pixels, so that way it really stands out as a solid container. And then I made the border around each cell thinner, so that way it was easier to see everything as a whole going, like reading across the table. You can see that we have the text now is all sans serif, so that makes it easier to read. And then we've got a lot more spacing. Now we have more spacing than we really need because we have the fixed width. So it's making it so there's more space, and so we could actually go and remove that if we wanted to, or find another way of dealing with it. But I would definitely say I think that padding makes a huge difference, and I think having the border be a lot more subtle makes a huge difference in making that easier to read and just making it look kind of more clean and modern. And then if we wanted to make the caption stand out a little bit more, there's a few more styles we could add to it. Because right now it's kind of working well as what you would think of as more of a caption, but if we wanted it to work a little bit more like a title, we could go in and add in font weight, set that to bold. I'll do font size 1.2M to make it a bit bigger. And then this is at least my preference. I think they put the text I think the default is the text is just really close to the edge of that, which again, I don't think would be bad for a caption necessarily, but I think it doesn't look very well if it's being used as a heading. So just making it a little bit bigger, adding a little bit of space between that. I think that goes a long ways to make that look a little bit better. Now, the next thing that I want to look at, we are going to be looking at working with classes, and then from classes looking at pseudo classes. So you can see the benefit of using pseudo classes. I think you already know that there's some good benefits to using pseudo classes, like what we used with the links. Now, let's say that you wanted to style particular areas of your table. You could use classes, and I mentioned earlier that we were going to alternate the colors and do that. And so what I'm going to have us do is for the TD and the TH, I'm going to have us add in border style none. And I'm going to add that at the bottom here, so that way I still have this history. So that way you know that we had added it at one point. But now we're going to replace it with border style none. And so it's going to remove those. So this would be hard to read because there's not really an easy way, especially if you had a lot of information or if it was really small, it'd be really hard to kind of see everything all together. And so we're going to be using color to help instead of the border, just to show that there's different options. So I'm going to create a class, and it's going to be called alt row for alternative row. And it's going to have a background color. And it's going to be set to CCCC33. And I'm kind of picking all my colors from the school's colors. And so we have this row. Now we want to apply it. So I'm going to have us apply it to every other row. And this is where it might get a little bit overwhelming. So we have our first row. And you can kind of decide, do you want to start with the first one or do you want to start with the second one? I'm going to do the second one. And so I'm going to say class is equal to alt row. And then you want to locate the third one, skip it, go down to the fourth one, do class equals alt row. And then find the next one, skip it, go to the next one. And this is why I wanted you to have multiple things to put in your schedule so you could actually see this. If you only have a few things, you're not going to see it. So even if you just repeat the same thing. So now we have this kind of green color is now alternating. And it just kind of helps pair the information as you read it across. It makes it easier to read than if you were just looking at the borders. So it's going to help lump things together to make it easier. And then we could also make another row, or we can make another class. Maybe it's called alt row 2, and then we could apply it to the other ones, and that would be a nice way of handling this. Now, just like with everything else, we're always trying to find ways to do things more efficiently and to save ourselves time. You know, it's just like when I talked about working with classes, we like working with classes because it allows us to easily update and change one style that gets applied to a lot of different things. Now, there's ways that we can actually make this easier too, because right now I've had to add this as a class to 3 different rows. Now, if we had a table that had 100, we'd have to go and do this 50 times, and it would take forever. Every time that we would want to maybe update maybe the name of it or something, it would just take forever to go in and change things and modify them if we needed to. So you can actually use Logic to help you instead. So let me find the pseudo classes as they're mentioned in this chapter. So here we have CSS structural pseudo classes. And there's going to be some that aren't necessarily part of working with a table. They just kind of use this opportunity to talk about them all together at the same time. So there is a first of type, first child, last of type, last child, and then nth of type. And this goes kind of back a little bit to that conversation of the parent-child, where you have a container. Let's say it's your main, and then you have things inside of it. Let's say that you have a main and a bunch of paragraphs. So if you had the first of type, and you'll notice it's going to be the same thing like where you had the pseudo classes when you were working with the anchor links for the navigation, where you would say the anchor link first of type. So that would be saying the first of the anchor links is going to have whatever style you want. Where you could say the first child of the main is going, or the first paragraph child of the main. So the first time it sees a paragraph that is inside of that container, then it's going to apply a style. So some of these you could kind of tackle in multiple ways. Last of type would be the last of something. So if it was a list of paragraphs, it'd be like the last of the paragraphs, the last child of an element. And then nth of type is the one that we're going to use. And it ends up being kind of interesting because you can apply a number, or you can also put just odd or even. And it's written kind of weird. You basically have nth of type, and then where the n is in parentheses, that's where you put odd or even, or your number. So you could say the third. So every third of whatever thing. And this is really hard, I think, to visualize, which is why I like to look at this link that I have under resources. And we've already looked at the ones that are for the length, like this one. Here we looked at this one before where we can hover over it. And you can look at that again if you want to. But there's some good examples down further here that help show this logic. So here we have the first child. And so let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. So it's saying over on the left, I want the first child paragraph to be blue. And what that's happening, this idea of child, so we have the body has paragraphs, and then we have a div that has paragraphs. So this paragraph is the first child of this body. The body is the parent of everything in here, but the paragraph, this is the first child of the body, so it is blue. And then what's happening here is the div is another container, and so the first child of that container is also going to have blue. So it's saying whenever you have paragraphs that are children of something else, the first one of them is going to be blue. So trying to figure out this logic can be a little bit hard in the beginning. That's why I want to walk through these examples. But I do think they work really well. So here we have a descendant selector. So it's not necessarily the first one. So it's saying when you have an italic tag that is inside of a paragraph tag, then the first child italic is going to be blue. So here we have a paragraph, and it has this italics here for strong, and then it has another italics around strong. So the first italics that's in a paragraph is going to be blue. And then we can see there's another paragraph that also has two italic tags sets in it. And then also that strong is the only one that works. So that's with a descendant. So this one is saying that it has the first paragraph basically, and then that first paragraph's italic tag. So the italic tags that are in the first instance of a paragraph. So all italic tags that are within the first child paragraph. So we have, again, we've got the body. The first child of that body is this paragraph. And now all of the italics in that are blue. The second child of that it doesn't have any blue. And then we have the div container again. And this one has the first child of that is this paragraph. And so all of the italic tag sets in that are also blue. And it looks like that's kind of the majority of those examples. Let's see if there's any. Here we've got language one. Now this link actually goes into a ton of them And you can kind of get an idea for what they're usually applied to. Like, for example, here it has active and it has an anchor link. So that lets you know, okay, well, that a lot of times gets applied to an anchor link. Any of these ones that you see input next to, those are for forms. And then we have some other ones, like we've got, if it's empty, we've got if it's enabled. Here we've got that first child, first of type. Focus was one that was looked at for... That's one that's looked at for forms. We've got hover for links, input, that's more form stuff. Here there's an interesting one though. Language attribute, last child, last of type, link, not, nth child. But we're going to keep things pretty simple. Here we also have like after, before, so insert content after every paragraph element. So it lets you customize things a little bit as well. So what I want to do is go back to our example. And I'm going to actually delete these alt rows. If you want to use this as an example, you might just save a copy so you can keep those. And then I'm going to go back up to this alt row. And rather than deleting this, I think I might just comment it out. So I'm going to say that I want the rows, so tr, nth of type, and then it's up to us. Do we want it to be even? Do we want it to be odd? I'll just do even. And then I'm going to say, what do I want about it? I want the background color to be CC33. And now it's just going to, every other row, it's just going to do this no matter how many rows that we have. And you'll see now it's applying to everything. And this kind of helps illustrate too, like how this is just considered one row, like I was talking about earlier. And then we might want to add in another alternating color. So I'm going to just copy this, do another nth of type. This one I'll do is odd. Switch this color and let's see. I'll do 99CCFF. So it'll be kind of a blue color. Now I'm going to double check my styles, make sure there wasn't anything else that I wanted to change. I do actually want to change the header. So let's add in a TH style. And this one I'm going to say I want the background color to be 0099cc. And then I also, because I want this to stand out a little bit more, I'm just gonna do color white. So what happens with this is if you do not specify that you want the table header to have a different style, it's going to basically treat this as our alternating rows. So you can style the TH separately to essentially overwrite the pseudo classes so it doesn't accidentally apply the style you don't want. So I'm going to refresh this. So if I hadn't put in my own style for the TH, it would just put this light blue color behind it. And it probably actually still is applying it, and this is just kind of overwriting it. But now this is letting us have the header really stand out from the rest of the content. And then we're having the alternating color for everything else as well. I want to now talk about how we can actually work with creating different sections into our tables. And let me see if the book has a good illustration for this. So the idea here is kind of like when you're working with a website, a lot of times you might want to have kind of heading information at the top, and then you might want to have some sort of concluding information at the bottom. And I really like this example the book has where they have a timesheet And I think they used to have an example in an older edition of the book where they had a menu where it was your order, and you would basically be able to tally up how much everything costs, and then it would have the total for how much everything costed. So that's what I want us to do with this example. Is I want you to figure out if this was your schedule and you were trying to figure out, let's say, like how many classes that you want to take in the fall, and you wanted to figure out how many credits it would be. You could kind of figure all of that out. So I'm going to copy this. Now, I had said before that I couldn't think of a comment to put over this table for starters. So I think now what I want to do is I'm going to add a comment here, and I'm going to say this is going to be our, let's say alternating, or actually, I'll call this pseudo class, let's do pseudo class styles table, because we're looking at styles, but then also pseudo class. Maybe I could say and styles table is kind of the main focus, but I don't want to mess with this. I want to kind of leave it as an example. You're free to do what you want with it, but I do want to copy it so I can use a new version of it. I'm going to add in some breaks and then just copy this again. Now this one, I want the focus to be on table sections. And so like how this has the date, hours, the information underneath, and then the total, what they're doing is they're using these three elements. So I'll just write table sections. I'm going to go ahead and combine these because it's so straightforward. You have the T head, which is the table head. So whatever would be sort of the heading information. Technically, this is just going to be your TH anyways, but the idea is that you're actually organizing it in more detail so that if you needed to put more things inside of here, you could. So that's going to be the table head, or you could think of that like the table header, but it's the... I'll write table header. I'm a little worried that people will get confused because we already have the THs. And then this part of it is where I think things can get a little bit confusing. It kind of reminds me of the wireframe drawing that we were looking at. I think this is back with chapter 3, where there's a wireframe drawing where it had head, body, and foot, or footer. And that's actually what we have here, is we have the T head, and this uses T head tags. So anything you want to be in the header, you put in the T head. And then we have T body. This is like the main content. So yeah, T body tags. And then you have T foot, which is the footer content. And then it goes inside of T foot tags. And so we could take this same content here. And so this row with this header in it, this would be our T head. So I'm going to create a T head tags. And I'm going to select this row, cut it, indent, and then put it there. And again, if this is starting to get a little confusing to see, you could always add comments and say this is the header section of the table. Sometimes I'll even add in just some white space between the sections so I can keep track of it better. Then we're going to have the T body. Say this is the main content section of the table. And then this is where you would take all of your rows. Now we're going to take just everything because we don't really have a footer yet. So I'm going to cut all of that, put it here. And then I want to create a T foot. So we'll leave something to put in here. So I'm going to create a row in here, and we'll end up basically modifying this a little bit so it'll end up working. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we can refresh it and take a look at it. What's interesting about working with it like this though is the colors and everything reset with the container. So this T head, this is the first row that is inside of the T head. So now we have in our T body, this second row is the first row inside of that. And so that's why these colors are basically the opposite now, is because it's restarting that count all over again based off of the container that it's in. And then same thing if we had something in the T foot, we would actually have this blue color right next to each other because it would be the first row in the foot. And then we would also have this last one in the T body, and they would just happen to be the same color, depending on how many entries that you have. So that's something to be mindful of. For your homework, I don't want you to use the sections. I just want you to focus on just using the regular pseudo class and just alternating the rows. Based off the content in the homework, there's really no reason to add up everything and worry about it being in a body and everything. But what I want us to do is find a way to turn this into content that we could sum up. And my idea here is if we create another column that has credits, then we could say how many credits everything is, and then at the bottom we could have a total. So what we need to do to start with is we go back to our T head, and I would want to create another TH, and I'm just going to say scope equals column ID is going to be called credits, and we'll just say credits. And then inside of each of our rows, I'm going to create another one. It's going to say TD headers is going to be called credits, so it matches. And then I'm just going to say 3 credits, which is true for this class. Depending on your schedule, you might have to change this, but since everything I have is 3 credits, I'm going to just be able to copy this into every single row. Now with our last row, let me just refresh this for a second. With our last row, so we have class, meeting time, and we've got credits. I want to add basically total and credits. So I want the total to span the first 3 columns because I don't need the other information. And so I'm going to put in, we've got the 1 row, and we're going to have 2 cells. We're going to have this first one, and we're going to have the second one. The second one's going to have the total. Probably with JavaScript, there would be a way to actually total this up. I'm going to just have to count this. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ones, different numbers of 3. So we're going to have 15 credits. And then I'm going to put total colon so that we know that we're tallying it up. And then I need to say, I want the column span to be equal to 3, so that way it spans across all 3. Now, I also want this total, well, it doesn't really make sense for this to be associated with the meeting time or the class, so we don't actually have to associate this with a header, so that one I'll leave alone. This one though, I can go ahead and I can say headers is equal to credits, because that one makes sense. So let me save that and refresh. And this is where I was talking about where we get the blue right next to the other blue. So it ends up making it so it's not really fitting in very well. But what we could do then is we could add a style specifically for let's say it's a TR that is inside of the T foot. So let me go back to our styles. And let me see if this would actually work. So we could say, I want the TH and I want the T foot, the T foot's TR. Let's see if it will, or T foot TR TD. Let's see if it'll do that. So the cells that are inside of the row that is inside of the T foot, as well as the header. And then we could do other things too, like this total would look a lot better if the text was aligned to the right. So we could even use that. You could do the first child. So we could say the first TD that is inside of the T foot. All right, so this is all I wanted to cover in this video. There's a lot more that you could do with styles, but like I was saying before, a lot of it's stuff that you've done before. It's just a matter of you finding interesting and creative ways of being able to apply it to working with the table. As you can kind of see, this ends up looking really similar to what you're going to be doing in your homework. Let me see if I can pull that up. So you'll notice I've got this table over here, and then there's this table over here. It also is going to use the alternating rows. It's going to use the pseudo class of the nth of type, odd and even. It is also going to incorporate some other things that we've talked about, but we just haven't used a whole lot. So you're going to be able to use classes, like you'll notice the text inside of this second column is all left aligned versus everything else is centered. So that's going to be something that you're going to need to add. This color is going to be added using, I want to say it's RGBA, so that way you get a little bit of practice working with opacity and being able to work with that a little bit. But otherwise, most of this should be pretty straightforward. And again, I don't want you to use these sections, the T head, T body, T foot. Don't worry about any of that. Just keep it real basic rows is what I want you to do for that. All right, so if you've got any questions, you can leave a question in the discussion, or you can send me an email.